please. Here we go. And action.
A beginning and an end. A decisive battle, but no victor. A pā built to fend off a superpower, defended, then abandoned. The Battle of Ruapekapeka in January 1846 was the final act of New Zealand's complicated Northern War, a war that started explosively with Heke's famous attack on the flagpole at Kororāreka, or Russell, but which fizzled out just 6 months later. Yet its ghosts still stalk Te Kai Tokero to this day. On a hill 14 kilometres southeast of Kawakawa and halfway to nowhere, Māori were bombarded for a week and a half.
Absolutely terrifying. To have 30 tonnes of artillery rain down upon you for 10 days, one can only imagine.
Outnumbered 4-1 by the British Redcoats.
This is the world's sole superpower at the time, up against really a civilian population.
Yet remarkably, when the British troops finally charged the pā, scrambling up this hillside, they found it all but empty.
They deserted, they left it. And they had no reason to set up anywhere else. They'd proven their point, or whatever that point was, it was proven.
An anticlimax? In terms of guts and glory, perhaps. But the story of Ruapekapeka is much bigger. It was a turning point in Māori Pākehā relations, the first clash over Te Treaty of Waitangi. So why were Māori and Pākehā at war in the north? How had it come to this less than 6 years after the treaty that was meant to bind the peoples together? Why does this battle stand out in the history of warfare, and what is its legacy today? Ko ngā puhi te iwi, ko ngā te kuta te hapu, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Shannon Honui Thompson ahau. 170 years on, we want to take you back to the battle. The Battle of Ruapekapeka.
No sooner had the ink dried on his signature on Te Tiriti, the governor then turned around and said all grog shops need to be licensed, and his didn't get a licence.
Trading food to colonists in New Zealand and Australia had made Ngāpuhi rich and powerful. When the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, many iwi leaders were keen to double down. But 5 years on, relations between many northern Māori and the British had gone sour. Arapeta Hamilton describes the experience of one of his tupuna, Pōmare, a Ngāti Manu rangatira, who had made his tribe rich trading with European sailors in the Bay of Islands.
The second thing was, they called it moni tauranga, which is tolls from the ships that anchored in the Bay of Islands. The governor comes up to him and says, "Oh, you can't collect that moni tauranga anymore. Belongs to Queen Victoria." And then the third thing that happened was the capital of New Zealand was moved from Okiato, which was on his land, to Auckland. Ngāti Manu went from a wealthy tribe to a very poor tribe in a matter of a few years.
Historian Vincent O'Malley says the experience of Arapeta Hamilton's tupuna was a common one.
After 1840, that relationship with the British Crown starts to unravel fairly quickly, and really all of the rangatira share some concerns. None of them voluntarily ceded their rangatiratanga to the Crown. I mean, the treaty promised that would be protected.
Ngāpuhi debated among themselves what to do. One faction, led by Heke and Te Kawiti, argued it was time to assert their status as the rulers of the north. Another faction favoured peace. Among them was Tāmati Wakanene, but it wasn't a simple matter of being for or against the British. Here's David Green, who's of Ngāi and Pākehā descent and works as a historian for the Ministry of Culture and Heritage.
All sides, both sides and the neutrals, all probably wanted to remedy this situation, and it was more a matter of tactics as to how this would be achieved. Nene he'd been a supporter of the missionaries for a long time, and he also was much more positive about the governors and the British official structure than people like Kawiti, who had only very reluctantly signed the treaty very, very late in the day. He really wasn't convinced it was a good idea at all. And there was also an element of pre-existing tensions among different hapu of Ngāpuhi that had been going on for decades, and personal elements as well. One of the books I read put it, Heke was a man of many thoughts, which was a polite way of saying, I think, that he was inconsistent, and certainly he had a decent-sized ego. There's no question about that. Older chiefs who'd been of high status for a long time, like Nene, I have the impression they couldn't really stand Heke. Some of them, they just saw him as an upstart.
Heke had been the first to sign the treaty, but was becoming disillusioned as Māori authority and economic growth seemed to wane. As tensions grew, Heke chopped down the flagpole in Kororāreka, Russell. Not once, but 4 times. By the 4th and final time, the flagpole had been encased in steel and surrounded by soldiers. The town was on a war footing, a warship sat in the bay, still Heke came. This is where the Northern War turned bloody. Ngāti Hine chief Te Kawiti created a diversion in the township so Heke could get to the flagpole on the hill. Kawiti and his warriors attacked the local garrison, killing 40 British soldiers. Kawiti was the master strategist of the Northern War. He was nearly 70 when the conflict began, a veteran of the musket wars of the early 1800s. Pini Hinare from the Ruapekepeka Trust and a descendant of Kawiti says the Europeans nicknamed him the Duke, Te Ruki, in recognition of his skill as a military commander.
He's a veteran who'd served in well over a dozen campaigns right across the country, from the musket raids to the south. We know that he commanded a presence wherever he went. The missionaries described him as somebody who was no muck around kind of a person. In fact, when asked at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi whether or not he should go and consult with his people, he simply turned around and said, "I'm the rangatira, I tell them what to do."
Let's fast forward to early December 1845, 9 months into the war in the north. The British have got serious. The number of redcoats deployed to New Zealand from around the empire increased by a factor of 10. Now 1,300 British troops with 400 Māori allies led by Tāmati Wakanene are slogging over 30 kilometres of rugged bush country, hauling 30 tonnes of artillery with them. Their goal is to deliver a decisive blow against the forces of Kawiti, Heke and their allies, holed up at a new pā called Ruapekepeka. This was an army just 30 years before that had faced down Napoleon. It knew how to use artillery to soften up an entrenched enemy, how to use close-order troops to lay down steady and effective musket fire. They were technologically superior. They had guns and cannons and explosive rockets forged in the fires of the Industrial Revolution. Here's historian Vincent O'Malley.
This is the world's sole superpower at the time, up against really a civilian population. Māori are hugely outnumbered through most of these conflicts. They don't have heavy artillery. At a highway in Ruapekepeka, there's a couple of rusty old cannons, but that's it.
But the British weren't invincible, and that's partly because their army neglected the human element of warfare. The organisation of the British Army had remained unchanged since the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. It was inflexible and brutal.
This is still the pre-reform British Army, and it's pretty appalling. The pay is terrible, the food and the housing conditions are terrible, alcoholism is rife. And, you know, people who witness floggings of British troops, some are left in tears, are just distraught at what they've witnessed. And so the British Army is really quite a barbaric institution at this time.
Presiding over this barbarism was the officer class, and they were often hardly more competent than their troops. These were the days of paid commissions, where if you put up enough cash, you'd be instantly promoted, regardless of your experience or ability. The man in charge of the British forces is a classic example of what this corrupt system produced. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Edward Despard.
Despard, when he arrives in New Zealand, is about 60 years old, and he hasn't seen active service for about 30 years. He's a very obstinate person, and he's also very contemptuous of Māori. And shortly before his first action at a highway, Tamati Wakanene comes to see him and to offer his services and those of his people. And Despard replies, if I want assistance from savages, I'll let them know. And the translator is so concerned by this that he refuses to tell Nene this, because he knows that he'll probably just storm off greatly offended by this. And later on at a highway, when Despard makes it clear that he's going to storm the pā, Tamati Wakanene says, he tangata kuware tēnei tangata, and Despard again asks his translator, what did the native say? And the translator at first refuses to tell him, and he's ordered to eventually, and he says, you're a very stupid person, sir. And of course, well, Tamati Wakanene was right, because what happened at a highway was a massive and demoralising defeat for the British. They were mown down in huge numbers.
This lack of leadership talent at the heart of the British Army eventually led to the catastrophic logistical and tactical blunders in the Crimean War and Indian Rebellion of the 1850s. What's worse, as they were marching to Ruapekepeka, the British-led forces were demoralised. As O'Malley says, 5 months earlier, Despard led them to a horrific defeat in the Battle of Ruapekapeka. That's despite the British and its allies outnumbering the defenders 6-1.
At a highway, you had 300 troops storming the pā. Despard had been bombarding it for a week, and he thought that there would be significant damage. What he hadn't accounted for was the fact that Māori had developed anti-artillery bunkers, so they were perfectly sheltered from this. And those 300 troops get within 20 metres of the pā, and all of a sudden a ferocious fire comes down on them. And 1/3 of them are cut down within the space of 10 minutes, 40 killed, 70 injured.
A bloody full stop was put on that conflict when one Māori warrior grabbed the hair of a fallen British lieutenant, sliced his scalp away and held up the trophy to the retreating British forces. The victorious defenders burst out in a haka. You can imagine that story being told around the British campfires as they marched, step by step, to an even better defended pā commanded by Te Riki Kawiti, the very same rangatira who had led the successful defence of Ohio. But it doesn't seem to have played on the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Despard.
One of the greatest defeats that the British suffer in New Zealand, and this is a point when Despard should realise that Kawiti is a formidable military commander, but he fails to heed that lesson. Ruapekepeka, again, a pā built and designed by Kawiti, And again, he's determined to storm it.
The Māori military leadership wasn't exactly a meritocracy either. The war leaders were all rangatira, aristocrats. But those rangatira had the advantage of having risen to power during the Musket Wars, at a time when all North Island Māori, and the people of Ngāpuhi in particular, revolutionised their methods of war. Here's historian David Green again.
Musket Wars that's from the 1810s to the 1830s brought a huge evolution in how Maori fought. You can kind of see what happened in the 1840s as a progression from that, rather than a sweeping innovation, because what they had to do during the Musket Wars is find ways to fight with muskets and also ways to not to be killed by muskets. And that meant traditional powers were changed quite markedly during this period so that they would resist musket fire particularly, and even artillery fire, because artillery was used by many iwi during the Musket Wars.
30 years' experience might sound like a lot, but in terms of the size of the change that happens, it's extraordinary. In Europe, the transition to gunpowder happened over hundreds of years, and Europeans incorporated these weapons into battles that already featured bows and arrows, crossbows and catapults. Māori, on the other hand, had a culture of warfare which pretty much exclusively involved close combat weapons like taiaha and patu, and yet completely changed their way of fighting in just a few decades, to the point where in battles like Ohaiawai they could beat the Europeans at their own game. Vincent O'Malley thinks part of the reason Māori were able to navigate this change so successfully is down to social structures.
Māori society in the early 19th century was highly competitive because there's not a single political authority in the land. There are hundreds and hundreds of hapu who are essentially autonomous and control their own affairs. And historians who debate this question of why did Europe advance so much from the 16th century onwards often come back to this answer that part of the reason stems from the fact that there were multiple political entities within that who were highly competitive with one another. So there's this rivalry that you don't have somewhere like China, which is a more unitary political system. And so, you know, there are comparisons with what's happening within Māori society in the early 19th century in a similar kind of way, that because there is this intense rivalry between different hapu and what's been described as the pursuit of mana, they're all very receptive to any new technology or any new ideas that might allow them to more successfully pursue the interests of their own hapu.
Māori had already proven they could adapt to firearms, but the Northern War brought a new challenge. Artillery bombardment. Explosive rockets and shells which had never been seen in New Zealand before. A few cannons were used in the Musket Wars, so artillery wasn't totally new to Māori, but the British didn't just have one or two cannons, they had more than a dozen heavy weapons. The usual way to deal with an artillery bombardment in those days was to shoot back with your own cannons, or to get around the flank and attack with cavalry. Kawiti's forces didn't have cavalry and only a couple of old rusty cannons. They needed something new, a kind of defence never seen before in New Zealand.
Māori did respond to the threat posed by British artillery in incredibly ingenious ways. They designed new power that incorporated what were anti-artillery bunkers, essentially. They've got trenches, tunnels, covered pits, really intricate and complex designs that are so remarkable that British observers refused to believe that mere natives could have designed these themselves. And in fact, Despard says something along those lines after Ohaiawai.
These trenches, and particularly the anti-artillery bunkers, were revolutionary. Mortars and rockets didn't have the explosive power to breach them. Ngāpuhi have many explanations for where Kawiti's ideas for these defences came from. I've been told Kawiti was inspired by the Ngāti Hine hunting burrows made for tuna or eels, and took inspiration from the way they would hide in the burrows under the bank. Pini Hinari of the Ruapekepeka Trust thinks the idea came in part from Kawiti's experience of the musket wars. In some of those battles, Māori dug small trenches and piled earth and logs on top of whare to defend them from cannon fire. He says others have more mystical explanations.
When I grew up, our tupuna always talked to us about astro travel and how our ancestors were able to do that. Travel to distant places, wairua in spirit. And I think when I think of a place like this, he clearly saw something in the world that we didn't see, that we didn't know. He was able to have an outer body experience, if you like, to be able to coordinate exactly what went on here, not just at Ruapekapeka, but in Te Taitokero. So combine that with his experience in war campaigns, his strong spirituality. We know that Tohunga led battles with our warriors and our toa of past. And when you combine that all, I think it stands as a temple, if you like, of what warfare really was for our people back then and how brilliant he was as a tactician.
And it wasn't just how these pā were built, it was where Kawiti built them.
So from here and other places in the pā, you can still see a clear line of sight to Hokianga and also to Rākau Mangamanga to the east. And the purpose of that was to unify the people of the north.
So that's Henare's take. It's a pā with a view. But the strange thing is that there was nothing there to defend. No settlements, no ammo dumps, no food stores. Here's O'Malley.
Kawiti deliberately builds these in very inaccessible, rugged and remote places. In the case of Ruapekapeka, it takes the British 3 weeks to carry 30 tonnes of guns and equipment over 30 kilometres. So they're travelling, they're making about a mile a day or something just to get there. And it's a huge feat even to do that. And the other key there is that the pā itself is not inherently valuable. It's of no strategic or other significance. So the only downside to that is of course, it requires a huge investment of labour to build it, but it can be easily abandoned afterwards.
The design of these new pā evolved over the course of the Northern War and reached its peak at Ruapekapeka.
It would have been sort of your traditional palisade pā, but probably on steroids. So we're talking tree size, we're talking 3 or 4 people in diameter as a whole palisade. And on top of that, they had bunches of flax, harakeke, bundled up along the pātū, wata along the pātū here, just to absorb the impact of all of the artillery. So, like I say, your normal pā on steroids.
What about the name, Ruapekepeka? Where'd that come from?
Well, Ruapekapeka is the bat's nest, and we call it Ruapekapeka simply because of the kinds of underground network that they had here for the caves, where people were underground in darkness, just like a bat is. And we know bats aren't on their own, they're usually in groups. So Ruapekapeka, the bat's nest.
The pā took over 6 months to build, and once it was completed, it faced the toughest of tests.
Absolutely terrifying. To have 30 tonnes of artillery rain down upon you for 10 days, one can only imagine. New Zealand had never seen the use of artillery like this in its history.
All up, the British had 3 naval 32-pounder cannon, 1 18-pounder cannon, 2 12-pounder howitzers, and a number of mortar and rocket tubes.
The bombardment began on the 31st of December as the first guns are brought into place. And in fact, on that first day, the shot fired from a 32-pounder that knocks out the flagstaff within the pā. And it also kills a woman who's holding a small child in her arms. And in some accounts, the woman is decapitated, and the child was said to be a grandchild of Kawiti. So you do have casualties right from the start. The full bombardment doesn't begin until the 10th of January, but the British are progressively firing into the pā as their guns are brought into place. So by the 10th of January, there'd been nearly 10 or 11 days of bombardment that's steadily gathering in tempo.
In some ways, it's surprising the British were able to field all this artillery. In fact, If they had wanted to, the defenders probably could have stopped these weapons from reaching Ruapekepeka at all.
You know, there is this talk that the Northern War was quite a chivalrous affair, and there are certainly aspects of that. For example, during the 3 weeks that the British took hauling their equipment up to Ruapekepeka, Kawiti had numerous ample opportunities to ambush that supply line and refused to take that.
On January the 10th, all of the guns were in place for the final earth-shaking bombardment. And yet, it wasn't enough to break Ruapekepeka. After 10 days under attack from the British artillery, fewer than a dozen people were killed or injured, and most of those casualties happened outside the pa during skirmishes. That's thanks to the sheer genius of the design of Ruapekepeka, built not just by warriors, but by wahine, tamariki and slaves. There were woven flax screens in front, too flimsy to stop a cannonball, but flexible enough to absorb the energy of a musket shot and tough enough to entangle a charging soldier, like the 1800s version of barbed wire. There were secondary trenches so runners could be sent to call for reinforcements or haul up supplies of food, water and ammunition without exposing themselves. Most importantly, there were underground bunkers, allowing the devastating artillery fire to pass overhead while the troops sheltered in safety. And surrounding it all was the wooden palisade made of pūrere trunks 7 metres high and more than 1 metre thick, their foundations sunk 2 metres deep into the soil.
The stories I've been told by my tūpuna were by strength of karakia and character. So I'm guessing karakia would have been the ability to control the elements around you, which includes tāne mahuta, papa tuanuku. And then the other side, of course, is character, which was a heck of a lot of hard work.
By the time it was finished, it was a masterpiece of military engineering. In his first episode of his 1998 TV documentary, The New Zealand Wars, historian James Belich said the pa at Ohaiwai and Ruapekepeka were of global significance.
British defeat in the Northern War was not the result of their own blunders nor of high Māori numbers, but of the Māori invention of trench warfare.
This claim that Māori invented trench warfare ignited a firestorm of controversy among military historians. They pointed out that there are accounts of people using trenches as fortifications going all the way back to Roman times, perhaps earlier. The debate continues.
You know, I don't know whether Māori invented trench warfare, but for me the more interesting question is why some people get so upset at the suggestion that they might have. James Belich has talked about this idea of the Victorian interpretation of racial conflict, the notion that Indigenous peoples could be so creative and ingenious and so on. And I don't know if there's an element of that and kind of the strong reaction against this, but a lot of the comment in response to Belich seemed to be more than simply about a matter of whether Māori had a role in the invention of trench warfare or not.
Part of the reason many historians resist the idea that Māori invented trench warfare is that their techniques were never copied by Europeans.
It's said that models of Kawiti's pa were actually taken around the North Island at least and studied. And of course the British also made models and studied them as well. Arguably the Maori remembered the lessons rather better than the British did when it came to the 1860s. The same kinds of structures were developed again in the 1860s by Maori during the main phase of the New Zealand Wars. And The commander of that army was Duncan Cameron, and he later became the head of Sandhurst, the Royal Military College. But my understanding is that in the curriculum at Sandhurst, it didn't teach anything relating to what you'd think they would have learnt in Waikato. Whatever they learnt on the spot, they didn't become part of the formal military study, and similar techniques of defence against artillery had to be kept being reinvented, including in 1914-15, when all the armies thought this is going to be a mobile campaign, and then had to adapt to the fact that it wasn't. I think it's partly that European military officers didn't think they had anything to learn from indigenous military experts, even when the evidence that they did was staring them in the face.
But the fact trench warfare was reinvented more than once doesn't make Kawiti's entrenchments any less impressive.
I think we need to acknowledge these as incredible feats of military engineering in their own right, regardless of any debate about where that fits in the lineage of trench warfare. Māori did come up with these ideas on their own, and Kawiti was a military genius, and he should be acknowledged for that.
But no level of military genius could remove the fear factor of tons of artillery falling around you. But as Henare says, the defenders had other ways of coping.
One particular account from an Irishman who was on the other side of the pā, they could hear haka and waiata, and I'm guessing it's not waiata hari, but it would have been something like a pau or a ngeri they could hear raining out during the night and in the morning.
To keep them going, to keep them focused.
Motivation, lament perhaps, scared, moke.
What's more, in those final days before the bombardment began, the warriors of Ruapekepeka readied themselves, not just their body, but their mind and spirit, their wairua. These rituals would have been overseen by a tohunga, an expert priest or healer. One modern-day ngāpuhi tohunga is Te Wārahi Hitaraka.
My auntie had a real gentle way of relaying the story to me of how her great-grandfather prepared his warriors for battle. It was our wairua. It wasn't preparing the tinana, they were already young and strong. But the whole 3-day wānanga was preparing the wairua, preparing them mentally for the task ahead of them. And which means that the wānanga would have covered several topics of importance in regards to the coming battle. The physical wasn't the focus. It was ko te kia haka kahangi o hoki te wairua roto hoki te tinana. Mā tēnā ka haere tika hoki te tinana roto hoki te mea, te pakanga.
And it's worth remembering that it wasn't just warriors in those bunkers. Women and children too played active roles in the fighting.
It wasn't just the boys, we had kōtiro here, wahine here who served those roles. We know of stories of 10 to 12 years old young people here in the pā at the time.
And what's their role?
One role in particular was to continually reload muskets for the battle, in preparation for the battle. But during the time of the bombing, for the mortars that came into the pā here, their job was to run out and, if they could, defuse by pulling out the wick. You had to be small, you had to be agile, you had to be fast and quick. So it was an occupational hazard, but a necessary one.
Te Wārahi Hitaraka's great-uncle was one of those young boys in the trenches. Pene Amene Rino was just 10 years old during the Battle of Ruapekapeka.
The young boys were positioned in the trenches, and their role was to receive the empty muskets from the warriors, load them, and then pass them back up. That's a huge job for a 10-year-old, come to think of it. I see, I know those ramrods, they're quite long. They have to pump that down. They've got to make sure they have the right shot in there so they don't blow themselves up. And then the wadding on top of that, and then the ball, and gosh, they could shoot themselves trying to pass it up even. But, that's the mahi that those kids did.
It seems horrific by today's standards. Imagine bringing your kids to a war zone. But it wasn't just Māori who did this. The British often had boys as young as 10 helping load the big guns on their warships. They called them powder monkeys because they could scramble into all the small places on a warship where adults couldn't fit. Days of bombardment, 10 days a superpower threw all it had at the bat's nest. After all that, it looked as if the cannons had blasted holes in that thick wooden palisade in 3 places. Seeing this, Lieutenant Colonel Despard wanted to storm the pa almost immediately, the way he had at Ohaiowai.
Despard kind of epitomises what you get as a result of an army where you have officers not necessarily appointed on the basis of merit. I mean, he's not alone in underestimating Māori military achievement, and there are many more who follow who fall into a similar trap. There is this kind of arrogance about his approach and his unwillingness to learn from the disaster at Ohaiowai, which is probably the most staggering thing, because he was proposing to repeat precisely that same experience at Ruapekepeka of storming the pa, confident that British artillery would make that an easy task to achieve. And of course that wasn't going to be the case at all.
Luckily for the Redcoats, Despard was talked out of a head-on attack by people who'd seen the consequences of a frontal assault on one of Kawiti's pa.
Tamati Wakanene, who was there at Ohaiowai, had warned Despard against doing this, and he'd been ignored, he'd been overruled. And then he was also at Ruapekepeka, and again he pleaded with Despard not to go ahead with this attack on the pa. He predicted that there would be a similar outcome to Ohaiowai, which had been a disaster for the British. Despard again wasn't interested in advice from, as he described it, a mere savage. And it was only the fact that Governor Grey was there and Nene pleaded with Grey, who finally intervened. The fact that the governor was there on the ground at Ruapekepeka probably saved many lives as a result.
Instead, Nene's men went in to scalp the pa. You can imagine them nervously creeping towards the palisade, ready to drop flat on the ground at the slightest hint of the enemy. But when they reach the pa and look inside, they find nothing. The fortress they had spent weeks struggling to reach and battering with artillery was virtually abandoned. The only people inside were Kawiti himself and a small group of warriors. It was a golden opportunity.
For the British, the person of Kawiti himself would have been a huge target, and his capture or death would have been a tremendous blow against Ngāpuhi.
The British forces raced up the hill and slipped through the breaches in the wall.
It would have been rather confusing given it would have looked deserted. There were a few warriors simply to hold off the onslaught or hold off the oncoming raid to allow others to escape.
Kawiti and his men fired one volley at the attackers, then fled out the back of the pa. This is the greatest mystery of Ruapekepeka. Why, after going through so much effort to build this defensive masterpiece, did Kawiti leave it so lightly defended, especially after Ohaiowai?
We could only guess, but at Ohaiowai, which of course was comparatively very easy for the British to get to, Kawiti had won his victory by almost goading them into a direct frontal assault, holding fire until they were 40 or 50 yards away and then just mowing them down. And it would be reasonable to guess that he was hoping to repeat that on a larger scale.
And yet he doesn't do that.
Possibly the difference is that this time the big gun or guns, they had actually clearly made a significant breach in one of the angles of the pa, which they didn't achieve at Ohaiowai. The fact that Nene's scouts were able to just walk in, basically, clearly it was the defences were impaired.
But while to the British it may have looked like Kawiti and his small band of fighters were fleeing in terror, most historians these days, including O'Malley, think it was a trick.
The small group were remaining inside the pa as a kind of target to lure the British into a trap, because that they then attempted to draw the troops into the bush behind the pa, where Māori would obviously have an advantage in close hand-to-hand combat, and that would neutralise British artillery and so on. And so the idea that this might have been a plot to lure the British into fighting on terms where Māori would have the upper hand, I think is probably a stronger explanation for what took place.
If so, the plot wasn't terribly successful. Here's Green again.
Supposedly the complication was that the rumour got around that Kawiti was still in the pa, or had actually been captured or killed by the British, because of course he had been in the pa with perhaps 10 men and fired one volley before leaving the pa. So his men were determined to go back and rescue him or retrieve his body or whatever, and it took a while for them to be convinced that in fact Kawiti was with Heke behind the lines, as it were. And by that time the British officers had gained some control over their men and prevented them from charging off into the bush, although a number did and were killed.
In the end, casualties from the Battle of Ruapekapeka were equal, about 50 killed or injured on either side. Most of those deaths happened at that final skirmish at the rear of the pa. Before long, the defenders melted away into the bush and the redcoats were left occupying a pa with no wider significance. All of which leaves us with a question that's hard to answer. Who won the Battle of Ruapekapeka? Governor George Grey immediately insisted Māori had been severely punished. The Crown claimed the final and complete subjugation of the rebels. All spin and nonsense. But neither was it the kind of decisive military victory Kawiti achieved at Ohaiowai. He and Heke couldn't claim to have defeated the British. Today, however, Northern Māori claim a victory of another kind.
I'm going to tell you, we won. We like to take a moral victory, but historians will have it however they see it. For us here at Ngāti Hine and the people of the North, we see this as a victory for our people. One, because of what we constructed here. Two, because of what we stood up against. And three, because this is still here today as a legacy and a reminder for us all of what our ancestors represented.
You can see it in the faces of a lot of our people. When the British finally got into the pa at Ruapekepeka, there's nobody there. One of the main customs that our people exercise during battles, especially kei roto hoki te pātū wata. I te wā, ko maringiringa hoki te toto, ko wehe rātau I tēnā. And that's what they just deserted it and never went back there. Served its purpose. It's tested the opposition, but it didn't defeat the people. Because we're still here today.
In the immediate aftermath of Ruapekepeka, Grey proclaims it as a brilliant success. He speaks up victory, but almost acts as if he's been defeated. By contrast, Hane Heke and Kawiti remain at large. If anything, their mana and their standing has only increased as a result of what's happened. And I think the crucial thing and the telling thing is that the flagstaff on Maiki Hill remains down. And it's only re-erected again in 1858, not by the Crown, but by Ngāpuhi themselves.
The battle for Ruapekapeka was the final conflict of the Northern War. Governor Grey pardoned the rebels, as he called them, and, as O'Malley said, never replaced the flagpole. Hone Heke, in exchange, gave Grey his own greenstone mere, a token expressing recognition of the settlers' right to remain in New Zealand and of his expectation that the Queen would uphold te tiriti. Both sides seemed to decide they had too much to lose by continuing the fight. The British were scared that prolonged conflict would frighten away settlers from Auckland, smothering the new capital before it had a chance to bloom. For Hone Heke and Kawiti, the problem was a lack of resources and manpower. And tragically, the economic issues which helped start the war in the first place remain unresolved. If anything, the situation gets worse.
It devastated our people, not just in terms of loss of life and land, but because we know that immediately after the Battle of Ruapekapeka, the seat of power in the country shifted out of the north and down into Tāmaki Makaurau. So that's all. Poverty hit our region, poverty that hadn't been experienced given the boom times in the Bay of Islands. So it's had very much a negative impact on our people.
Some in the north, such as Arapita Hamilton and Te Wārahi Hitaraka, say the struggle that began in 1845 still goes on today.
The legacy of the wars for our people is that we never lost the war and that we have to keep striving to a stage where we achieve our rangatiratanga, whether that's with our own governance or something, we will find it. Tai mai a te wā, ka kitea la tātou te huarahi tika ke tai tātou ki tō tātou rangatiratanga.
The war's still to be won, I think. The battle's still to be won, and I think it's a different kind of a battle. And I think for me, it's righting the wrongs of the past for the benefit of all of us, both Pākehā and Māori. Because if that's not fixed up, we're going to continue to be in conflict. And our people will continue to suffer. Yeah.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa e whakarongo mai nei. This podcast was presented by me, ko Shannon Honui Thompson Aho, produced by the amazing William Ray and Tim Watkin. Engineer was William Saunders, and we had a bit of help with this one. So thanks to my friend, i te tuakana, Mihi Ngā Rangi Forbes, i ngā rangatira, Vincent O'Malley, Penny Hinare, David Green, Arapita Hamilton, and Te Wārahi Hitaraka. And of course the team at Great Southern Television and New Zealand On Air. You can find other podcasts, including the Great History series, such as Black Sheep and Eyewitness, on the RNZ website or app. Or if you prefer, iTunes, Spotify, Radio Public, or wherever you can get your podcasts from. Ngā mihi nui anō ki ngā kaikorero katoa o tēnei hōtaka, noho āhuru mai, tēnā koutou katoa.